Hello, and welcome to the Mind Report. I am Laurie Santos, professor of psychology at Yale University, where I study the evolution of decision-making, and I'm talking with
Carey Morewedge, associate professor of marketing at Carnegie Mellon University.
Cool. And today we're going to be talking about some of Carey's cool work on the psychological processes that underlie some of our quirks in judgment and decision-making. Those of you who are aficionados of the Mind Report probably know that Carey joined us on the Mind Report before, talking with my colleague Josh Nobe about some of his work on kind of weird quirks of the way we see intentional agents. Today we're going to be talking about some of Carey's newer work on the quirks of judgment and decision-making. And thanks for coming out. I mean, I'm particularly psyched to talk with Carey because I think of all the folks doing research in judgment and decision-making, he has a research program that at first glance seems super broad. He was talking about things like why people watch football games and eat cheese and like old movies. But at the heart, they're sort of converging on these really specific psychological processes that go astray. And so on the one hand, it's really broad, but on the other hand, it's sort of tapping into these really specific processes. So I think this stuff's cool. Good. So the first set of experiments I wanted to talk about was some of the new stuff you've been doing looking at the origins and biases that give rise to some of our nostalgic preferences. So what are nostalgic preferences, just so you can get rolling?
So if you ask people across a variety of years, whether they're older or younger, if you ask them in this decade, if you had asked them in the 1990s and 1980s, what you see is that people tend to think that the present compares poorly to the past when you compare similar categories. So for example, if you ask people, do you prefer the automobiles of today to the automobiles of your childhood? Most people prefer even something like an 80s Camaro to the cars of today, even though you think about the cars of today as being ostensibly much more reliable, more efficient, and perhaps, more aerodynamic. You see this not only in sort of things like automobiles, you see this in actors, you see this in sort of the quality of education, you see this in the quality of life. And so in all these different kinds of categories, people seem to think that the present compares poorly to the past. And what's interesting about this, which suggests it's not actually some difference between the past and the present, is that you see that people who were born, for example, in the 1970s think, cars in the 1980s are better. People who were born in the 1960s think cars in the 1970s were better. People born in the 1950s think cars in the 1960s are better. So every era or every generation seems to think that their past was somehow better than their present, which suggests that it's not necessarily about the past actually being better, but that people have these nostalgic preferences. So nostalgic preferences are a little different from the emotion we have in nostalgia. So we might have a feeling of nostalgia, and that might be in response to some kind of memory that we have of the past. A nostalgic preference is more the belief that the past is somehow superior to the present.
Got it. And so it seems like a puzzle. What's it due to? What have you guys been looking at?
Right. So there's been a number of people looking at this kind of question, and so most of the work has been really trying to establish the different kinds of domains in which people exhibit nostalgic preferences, and also try to figure out sort of why people preserve these positive memories for the past. And so what I tried to do was use some psychological phenomena with which we're already familiar to see if that might explain why people think about the past as better than the present. And specifically, I'm looking at differences in what we call the availability of memory for past experiences and for present experiences, and see if differences in the memories that we have for sort of categories of autobiographical memory, which is memory that we think about when we have a past experience, so some kind of experience that we had, might explain these kinds of differences.
Got it. And so not all autobiographical memories are the same then?
Right. So what we find is over time, people show what's called a fading affect bias. And so we tend to forget negative memories more quickly than we do positive memories as time passes. And so as you see throughout time, sort of memory starts to show this basic kind of asymmetry in terms of our past experiences, whereas in the present, we might really remember sort of positive and negative things that happened very recently to us. So if you just went on a vacation, you might remember sort of the time at the beach, but you might also remember, your flight being delayed. Whereas when you think back to a vacation from, 5 years ago or 3 years ago, you're going to better remember the beach than you will your time in the airport.
Got it. And so what's the prediction then about nostalgic preferences? This memory bias gives rise to our thinking that things on average are better?
So I think really memory in the case of nostalgic preferences acts very much like a record store.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go to a record store, they have, from the 1700s, from the 1800s, from, the 1900s, they have sort of the top hits of those centuries, right?
Uh-huh.
So if you go to a record store and you think about sort of use a record store as as an analogy for the sample of information that we have in memory, you would conclude from going to a record store that there were no bad classical composers, right? Or that jazz in the 1920s was uniformly good.
Right. There's only the Beatles in the 1960s, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But whereas today, whether or not you like, Kelly Clarkson or Katy Perry or Lady Gaga, you might think, that there's going to be some good music and some bad music. And so if you just looked at this record store and used the record store to figure out sort of how good the quality of music was across different eras, you would come to probably what we would assume is a biased conclusion. So you would think that, that the past was somehow amazing and uniformly amazing, and the present has highlights and lowlights, but at the same time it is more mixed and more heterogeneous in terms of its quality.
And so how did you test this with actual participants to see if this worked?
So I did 3 experiments, 2 in the domain of television shows and 1 in the domain of movies.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first study, what I did was ask people to think about, on average, the quality of shows in 1 decade. So each participant only thought about 1 particular decade. So the study was run in 2005. So what I did was I had people think about the quality of TV shows from the 1980s, TV shows from the 1990s, or TV shows from their present decade, the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I asked them to do was recall a show, either their favorite or any show that they could remember, report how much they liked that show that they recalled. And then I asked them finally, how similar is the show that you recalled to all the other television shows of that decade?
Got it. Mm-hmm.
So that was the basic method that I used for the first study. And what I found was, although across the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, people tended to recall really good shows, so it didn't matter if I asked them to recall their favorite or any show. They tended to recall shows that were really good.
Yep.
People in all these cases recalled really good shows. But what I found was people thought that the shows of their present decade, so the 2000s, were worse than the shows of the 1980s and the 1990s.
Got it.
And so this difference was really sort of the first clue that we had, a sign of nostalgic preferences.
Mm-hmm.
And what seemed to drive these preferences was that people saw the television shows in the 1980s and 1990s to be more similar to their favorite shows like Cheers or Seinfeld than the shows of their present era. So you might, for example, think about The Wire as a great show from the 2000s, but when you were watching The Wire, you think about all the other bad shows like Joey, right?
Yes, right. But could it just be that the shows of the 80s and 90s were actually more similar and better? I mean, Brady Bunch, Seinfeld, all these things. Can we tell?
It's like Alf and Mr. Belvedere.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Silver Spoons. There's a lot of bad shows on television back then. And, that was a concern that I had. And I did a number of different kinds of tests to see sort of whether if I took shows from the 80s and 90s, whether people if I provided them with a sample of shows, whether people would rate them as being better than the shows of their present decade. Mm-hmm. And I didn't find that to be the case.
Got it.
And I also did another study where I asked people to recall a movie either from the most recent full year, which was 2010, or from the year in which they graduated high school. And so this way, the past memory wasn't necessarily specifically tied to a year, but it was across a broad range of years. And so I think it went back as far as the early 1970s. Okay. And so what I found there was there's virtually no difference in terms of the perceived quality of the film that they recalled from the year in which they graduated high school. Mm-hmm. But in all these kinds of cases, people tended to prefer movies from the year in which they graduated high school to movies of their most recent past year. And that preference seemed to be contingent on them seeing their favorite movie from the year in which they graduated high school as being more similar to those past movies than their favorite movie from 2010 being similar to the other movies.
Got it. So this is shocking for a couple reasons. One is it's suggesting that Dazed and Confused and the movies from 1993 aren't objectively the best movies in the history of film, which is shocking to me. But beyond that this funny quirk of the way we remember things, just the fact that we remember these overly good things, can bias us to sort of think that the present day is kind of crappy. So how do we overcome that if we want to kind of have a more balanced view of what the present is and a more balanced view of what happened back in the day?
That's a good question, and I think that's really sort of one of the challenges for psychology in general is to overcome these kinds of cognitive biases, because you really hold them very, very strongly. And an example of a bias that that I think is really nice is that I don't know if you're a Patriots fan, but there's a lot of press right now about Aaron Hernandez, and so he was a player for the Patriots. There's strong evidence that he may have committed a murder. And he's accused for it, but as a Patriots fan, like living in Boston forever, like I really have a hard time believing this, right? And there's all this evidence, and it's still I'm like, it can't be true, right? Yeah. And so like there's all this evidence against this case, and you still hold this belief. So if we're going back and thinking about nostalgia, I think making people think about the television shows that they saw and actually having them watch those shows would be a way of undoing that. And I think that this has some kinds of applications that we would, that are more broad than just sort of our preferences. In many cases, what we're trying to do is change practices. So, with civil rights movements and with changes in sort of the way that we view how society should be structured, I think a lot of people often have particularly people in positions of power have a preference for the way things were, and think that somehow, change is not going to necessarily be good because the way that things were great in the past. And I think that reminding them about all the kinds of negative, aspects of the way that things were in the past helps them overcome these kinds of nostalgic preferences or nostalgic beliefs about how we should structure society as well.
And so do we know if you give people a more biased sample of what the worst kinds of things were back in the day, did they update those nostalgic preferences? So if you pointed out to me all the bad movies in 1993, would I be like, maybe it wasn't as good as today?
So I haven't tested that in the case of nostalgic preferences, but I have tested that in other kinds of psychological phenomena where people are trying to predict future events. So similarly, the way we think about sort of when we're thinking about movies of the present or the past, our favorite movies come to mind first. If we're thinking about future experiences, often our favorite experiences or the most extreme ones come to mind. So, for example, if I'm thinking about the opening of the NFL season and someone asks me, how much will you enjoy the first game? I'm more likely to think about sort of the best game that I can remember than an average or bad game. And I'm likely to base that kind of prediction on my memory. So I think about the best game I can remember. I use that as a proxy for my future enjoyment of, the opening game of the season. But what I found there is if I get people to think about other games that they've watched, if I get them to retrieve a larger sample than one, then what happens is people give more tempered predictions of the future game. So if you ask people to recall 3 games that they saw, in that case, then people seem to give less extreme predictions than if I ask them to recall 1. Or if I don't ask them to recall any memory, it seems like people implicitly recall this extreme memory when they're making the future prediction.
Yeah, and that suggests that this bias that you're seeing in memory is broader than just like giving us weird preferences about movies back in the day. It's also messing up our future predictions about what we think we're going to like in the future and therefore our future choices, right? So you've done some work on this particular problematic issue of forecasting, right, and the impact bias that goes along with forecasting. So do you want to talk a little bit about some of that work?
Sure. So whether we're predicting sort of how we'll feel, about a presidential candidate winning the election or losing the election, or how we'll feel about getting a job or not getting the job, as professors, for example, getting tenure or not, or if you're thinking about how bad you'll feel if your romantic relationship dissolves. I mean, all these kinds of cases, people show what's called an impact bias. So they tend to overestimate the hedonic impact of both positive and negative events.
So I think if I get tenure, it's going to be the best thing in my life, and I'm going to be happy forever. And if I don't get tenure, I might as well kill myself because I'll never have a positive hedonic experience ever again.
Yeah. So Dan Gilbert did this really interesting study with professors at the University of Austin in Texas, and he asked professors who had yet to go up for tenure, and for those not familiar with tenure, it's like basically job security for academics. Right. And so they were, he asked people before they went up for tenure, how happy do you think you'll be if you get tenure? And he asked other people, how happy do you think you'll be if you are denied tenure? And then he also looked at people who had either received or were denied tenure and asked them how happy they were. And basically what he saw was that people who predicted if people who imagined getting tenure thought they'd be really happy afterwards, people who thought that they predicted being denied tenure thought they'd be really unhappy. So there's a big difference between receiving and not receiving tenure in the minds of predictors. But what he found in terms of experiencers was that people, whether they received or were denied tenure, there really wasn't any difference in terms of their happiness statistically.
And is that true even at the moment? Because obviously at the moment you find out when you open the letter and there's great news or bad news, it's bad, right? But it's just in the future.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple kinds of components of this kind of error in forecasting. So you think about the first aspect being we overestimate how bad or how good a positive event will be or a negative event will be. So we might imagine like running around in circles, screaming for joy when you get tenure. Your response is probably more likely to be a little more muted. And you can imagine that like never imagining like never being able to imagine how life will go on if you are denied tenure. And somehow, the majority of people who are denied tenure go on to lead satisfying, enriched lives.
Right. I mean, so I got tenure about 2 years ago, and the example in my case was that I was in a coffee shop frantically writing a grant that was due the next day. And I got a call from my chair and was like, went into her office. She's like, congratulations, you got tenure. And I was like, well, great, but I have to go back and finish this grant. So my little hedonic window of tenure happiness was like incredibly short. So it's true. It's true. But you've looked at these cases where affective forecasting goes awry, in part because of this specific memory error of the thinking that memory chooses these atypical events.
So I like a lot of previous work, I've been looking at how we rationalize these kinds of events, and so how easy it is to sort of explain away positive events or rationalize negative events. And so what I was looking at really wasn't necessarily looking at whether or not we have wrong theories about how events will feel and our response to them, more about whether the sample from which we draw from. So the way when we're predicting these kinds of future events, we make a mental simulation of what it would be like. So if you're imagining eating, for example, a pickle and peanut butter sandwich, whether or not you'd enjoy that, you have to imagine sort of the pickles and the peanut butter and how that would combine. And if we draw, when we're making these kinds of simulations, if we draw on evidence that's not representative or not necessarily diagnostic of the future experience, that's going to lead our simulations to give us faulty forecasts.
So if I'm thinking about whether or not I want to take a vacation and my memory pulls up the past vacation that's like super awesome or super extreme in one way, then I'm going to predict what I'm going to feel based on that extreme kind of non-diagnostic memory.
Yeah, so if you think about sort of a road trip, right? A road trip involves, I once did a road trip in college across the U.S. And basically the majority of my time was spent looking at corn and soybeans.
Yep.
And there were a few national parks in between. And so if I think about sort of the road trip, I'm going to think about the national parks and how amazing it was, to be in like Bryce Canyon and like, be on the salt flats and all these kinds of experiences. But I don't think about the majority of my time spent staring at corn. And so if I think about sort of how much, psychologists think about this idea of utility. So sort of if we want to think about an experience, we want to think about sort of the sum total of how pleasurable the experience was across time, right? So it's not just being at the national park, but if you want to think about how much you really enjoyed your road trip, you have to add in all that time spent looking at corn. Yep. So you may actually enjoy like watching a Downton Abbey marathon more than you would a road trip, right? Because even though there's less extreme experiences, like seeing Yellowstone or something like that, you're going to have more pleasure overall throughout the duration of the experience. And so when we're making these forecasts about what kinds of experiences to have, what vacations to go on, we tend to sample these sort of highlights of the vacation, and we tend to ignore sort of the more average or less exciting aspects of them. Yeah.
So this raises this question about how memory works in general, right? Because one characterization is like, memory just sucks. We only remember the extreme things, and that has all these terrible consequences for how we make choices and have nostalgic preferences or whatever. Another version is like, it's good for memory to remember these extreme things. Like, do you have an opinion one way or the other on that? Like, is our memory for atypical events good, or is it just part of our psychological biases?
Yeah, I think one of the things that psychology will probably transition towards, at least from decision making in the near future, is really looking at remembered utility. And if you think about our experience in life, most of our life is either going to happen to us in the future or has happened to us in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about your tenure experience, it's really sort of when you get tenure, it's that one when you're in your chair's office for that 30 seconds or 2 minutes, right? And that's the experience itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have sort of what before tenure you had however many years of prediction.
Mm-hmm.
And after tenure you have however many years of recollection. And so if we really think about utility, like what kinds of experiences impact our life, our memory of events is often much more important than the actual experience of the event.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go on a vacation, the vacation might be 2 weeks long. And certainly like you had a number of good and bad experiences during that vacation, but your memory of that vacation may span, 20, 30, 40 years. And so over the long run, your memory of the vacation may matter more towards your utility than sort of your experience of the vacation itself.
So that means we should strive to make sure we have good memories. We should throw out all the bad pictures. We should throw out all the recall cues of bad things just so we can have these sort of pure remembered utilities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much you want to wipe all of your
the slate clean. Yeah, it's a little Matrix style,
question.
Yeah.
But certainly in terms from a remembered utility perspective, it may be better to have cases where you have experiences with extremes, so extremely good moments, but with several mundane moments as well. So for a hike, for example, is a case where you struggle, right, the whole time you go up the mountain, but then you have this amazing view and you have this memory of doing something that was special. And then when you go down, it's a little more mundane as well. And so the experience of the hike itself may bring us little experience utility, but when we look back on that hike, that may be one of the most memorable kinds of experiences that we have with our friends or our family. And so that may be the kind of thing that really sort of we enjoy and savor after the fact.
That's cool. Well, the other thing you've been looking at, though, with these atypical memories is cases where atypical memories mess up our person perception, too, right? And you're trying to use some of these funny memories to explain these cases where people are bad at predicting how a specific person will act, even though they're good at predicting in general how a group of those same people will act. So what's that phenomenon, just so our listeners know?
So this was really inspired by an experience I had where I was at someone's house, and I looked at, they had on their dresser this display of different kinds of miniature pigs. And there's just...
This wasn't my house, but no.
There's just this huge collection of all these miniature pigs, and I'm like, do you really like pigs? Like, can you explain, what this is about? And the person's like, well, every time my husband goes and travels, he brings me a little miniature pig from wherever he's been. And I'm like, well, how did this happen? And she's like, well, one time he brought me a miniature pig, and I was like, oh, I like that. And I was surprised by it. And now he assumes that every time he goes away, I want a miniature pig, right? Yeah. So it's this idea of when we think about people, we think about sort of the most unusual features of that person. So if you have a friend who goes windsurfing, they probably have a lot of kinds of experiences that are less atypical, but you're going to think about them in terms of the person who goes windsurfing. Mm-hmm. And so these kinds of atypical kinds of behaviors serve as a way to distinguish a person from other people. So for example, if we met, in Connecticut, or if you came to Pittsburgh, we wouldn't really ever talk about the fact that we're, both Americans, right? Yeah. We're both living in the U.S. Mm-hmm. But if we met in Paris, for example, we would probably talk about the fact that we live in the U.S. at some point in time. And so in many ways, sort of the way in which we define ourselves are ways in which are optimally distinctive from other people around us. And so ways to sort of view ourselves as being distinct, but having shared properties with other people.
So this is a spot where paying attention to the atypical information is helpful because it might be diagnostic of differences, which is what we're trying to do, at least at first, but it's bad for predicting down the line.
Right. So if you go to a cocktail party with other psychologists, you're going to talk about what kind of psychology you do. If you go to a cocktail party with, people at your university, they're going to identify you as a psychologist. If you go to a cocktail party, at a comics convention, they're going to talk about you as an academic, right? So in these kinds of cases, the way that we often define people and ways that are useful for us to predict their future behavior is to think about sort of how they might be different. So we have an idea of how most people behave. We want to make some kind of adjustment for that. And so these kinds of sort of atypical beliefs or atypical memories about how people behave or their personality are often useful. But what I found is that people tend to overestimate sort of how how predictive these are of people's preferences.
Mm-hmm.
And so in sort of a modified laboratory version of the pig experience,
Mm-hmm.
what I did was I showed people a person's choices between different kinds of consumer goods. And so they saw like that a person could have chosen like a penguin soap dish or like 3 other different kinds of soap dishes, and then that were more normal,
Mm-hmm.
like less animal themed.
Yes.
And then I showed them sort of 3 other kinds, or I think it's 4 other kinds of animal themed, like 4 other consumer goods, and there each one in each set was an animal themed selection or option.
Yes.
And I asked, of the people who chose the penguin soap dish from this display, what do you think they chose from the second display, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth?
Mm-hmm.
And what I manipulated was, in the first display, the penguin soap dish was like as good as the other soap dishes,
Mm-hmm.
or slightly preferable. And in the other displays, it was less, the penguin or animal themed thing was less preferable than the other ones. So it was like pretty ugly.
Yeah.
But people still predicted, oh, this person chose this penguin thing. It's really unusual. In the first case, they're going to choose this. They prefer to have this over these much more preferable kinds of consumer goods
Mm-hmm.
in these other cases. And so it seemed like people made a pretty stark over prediction in that case. And then what I wanted to see afterwards was whether that was really due to sort of the availability of that information in memory. Mm-hmm. So you could think about, the object that the person preferred, or like what their behavior was, as being unusual, or you could think about it as being sort of, there are other features of it as well. So maybe that was the best way the person could behave or could choose in that option,
Mm-hmm.
When they're constrained with that choice set. And so people seem to forget about the constraints of the choice set and really think more about sort of the atypicality of the behavior.
So that when you think about the particular choice set, so when you go back to base rate information, the bias goes away.
Right. So there's some really interesting work that was done by Davis, Hoke, and Ragsdale. And what they did was they were looking at people's predictions about what other people would like.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that people are often better predicting for a stranger than they are for their spouse when they're like deciding what kinds of consumer goods people would prefer.
Huh.
Because in many cases, I think we tend to overestimate how varied our preferences are. Mm-hmm. So if I ask you, like, if I think about, would Laurie like eating pizza or kale, most people are going to like pizza. And so if I try to, once I have some information about you, that might lead me to overcorrect for this information.
Like you saw, like one Thursday in February, I picked the like kale dish, and you're like, maybe she likes kale now. And so
right, like I should choose the kale for Laurie. I should order the kale for Laurie rather than the pizza. Right. So and so what they found is that Nick Epley did some work with David Dunning on this too, where they're really looking at sort of people's predictions of how charitable they'll be. Mm-hmm. If you just give, if we just give people base rate information, people are pretty accurate in predicting how charitable other students will be when they're donating to a charity. If you give people just a little bit of information, like what major a person has or some of their likes and dislikes, suddenly people construct this kind of idea of what this person is like, and they tend to ignore the base rate information altogether. And so often the way that we think about people is very useful for predicting their future behavior. Mm-hmm. So if I know that you're a psychologist, I might predict what kinds of books you might like better, than if I know that you're a mathematician, but if I'm trying to think about, what your general preferences will be, mm-hmm. often these kinds of theories interfere in that. And so we often overcorrect for for the unusual behaviors that people exhibit, that define them, but at the same time are not necessarily predictive of most of their behavior.
So the way to get your spouse a good birthday present is to just think back, be like, yeah, he's my spouse, he has all these weird preferences, but basically he's just a human, or basically he's just a guy, or like...
Yeah, I mean, you can think when you're about to buy sort of some like lemon squeezer or something like that, like, what would this person, is this really sort of something that,
humans in general like? Yeah. Cool. Well, that's a useful tip for our listeners to think about for birthday choices. And I wanted to kind of end on some of your most famous stuff, looking at another helpful tip that you can give folks about how they can eat less if they're choosing to do that, and some counterintuitive stuff you have about this. So one of my favorite papers to come out of Science in the last couple of years was your recent paper showing that even sometimes the things that we think can affect our choices in the eating domain. And so you've been doing some work on the kind of imagined utility and how that can habituate people over time. So tell us first, like, what was the inspiration behind some of this stuff, and then we'll get to the study.
Well, so there's been a lot of work recently on embodied cognition, this idea that, like, your body can change the way that you think.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, like, maybe more interesting to me is sort of how thoughts change the body.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about there's a big debate in the eating literature about sort of what causes people to decide to end a meal.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you sit down and you're starting to eat potato chips while you're watching television, and you're eating the chips, and at some point in time you decide to stop. And, you know, one way that you might stop is you finish the whole bag,
Mm-hmm.
And then you run out of chips. But, like, a lot of people don't necessarily go that far
Yeah.
Into the bag before they end. And so what leads people to stop eating once they've started? And
of course, our lay notion of this is it should just be like when you get full, you stop eating,
Right.
And that's the only cue we use.
And that's why most Americans at this point are
obese, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't necessarily have that that signal from the body that you're full comes much too late to
Mm-hmm.
stop in time to eat an appropriate caloric amount of food.
Right.
And
So what is it, like 10 to 15 minutes later or something like that?
Yeah.
Right?
So your digestive system's not even kicking in until like 15 minutes later.
Yeah.
At this point, and giving you those kinds of signals. And so when you do feel full, you've basically overeaten and you should stop.
Mm-hmm.
But basically what I was trying to see is sort of, there's a lot of work in the addiction literature suggesting that thinking about a desirable stimulus, so thinking about a cigarette, or, you know, if you're thinking about a kiss from your favorite movie star, or, you know, if you're thinking about food, thinking about that kind of stimulus that we crave will lead us to desire it more.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, advice that's given to smokers often is like, try to keep yourself away from bars because people are smoking there.
Yeah.
If you're trying to eat less unhealthy food, you know, try not to have it at home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if you're trying to, you know, just in general, like, if people are trying to stop some kind of craving behavior, to try to avoid the stimulus altogether.
Yeah.
And so a lot of work that Dan Wegner has done really sort of suggests that trying to avoid thinking about kinds of things can often backfire. Mm-hmm. So if you try to avoid thinking about, like, he has this great study where if you, there's people playing footsies under a table, and some people it's public with another couple that these people are playing footsies. And in another case, people the other couple doesn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so people report having a much stronger attraction when the other person doesn't know. And so these kinds of secrets, or these kinds of suppressed thoughts, tend to often have a stronger impact than thoughts that we sort of think about and just note.
Yep.
So if you're trying to avoid eating cookies, if you're trying not to think about cookies, when cookies come to mind, you might think that you have a stronger craving than if you're allowing yourself to think about them. Mm-hmm. But this seemed to be incongruous with some work really from more cognitive psychology, looking at the role of mental simulation and actual perception. And so, for example, there's these what we find are really interesting mental rehearsal effects. Mm-hmm. So if you rehearse, for example, a simple sort of motor sequence, like playing some keys on the piano a couple times, people then afterwards show an improved motor performance after they've simulated that experience.
So the idea is, like, I don't even have a piano in front of me. I just practice kind of in my head and think about what it would be like. And in fact, I get better. Just as better as if you had the piano there yourself, or...
Yeah, so, and a lot of athletes report, you know, doing these visualization techniques to try and improve their performance. Mm-hmm. You can think from an emotional standpoint. So if I imagine a spider running across my leg, I can show the same kind of constellation of physiological responses, although muted, to that simulated experience as I would if an actual spider ran across. So I might show an increase in sort of the galvanic skin conductance of my skin, so how much I'm perspiring. You might see sort of an increase in pupil dilation. My heart rate might go up. You know, these might be imperceptible at sort of to myself, but if we hooked me up to some kind of EKG machine or some kind of electrodes, we could see that these kinds of responses are changing. And so really sort of there is this clash between a lot of the craving literature and a lot of the literature on mental simulation and the kinds of responses that it engenders.
So you were predicting that if we looked in the eating domain, if you had an imagined experience of eating, it could in some ways be like actually eating.
Right. So I thought basically what was going on was when in the craving literature, what they were asking people to do when they're looking at sort of how imagery affects desire or craving was to ask people to simulate what it would be like to encounter the stimulus. And so they asked people sort of imagine that you're eating a steak. What does the steak look like? How does it taste? How does it smell? Is it dry? Is it juicy? Where are you? And all those kinds of experiences are the kinds of things that we note when we first encounter a stimulus. But they weren't asking people necessarily to imagine the repetitive kind of consumption that accompanies the actual consumption of a stimulus.
So they were giving people the imagined experience of like the first bite of the steak, but not like, just 8 minutes into it when you took one bite too many kind of thing.
Right. So you think about, I think White Castle hamburgers are a nice example because they come in giant bags, right? And so the first White Castle hamburger that you have is awesome. And the second one might be really good. But, by the time you're at number 15, it's pretty bad, right? So, the pleasure, what we see is the pleasure that people derive from these kinds of repeated experiences decreases over time. So your first bite of the steak is going to be awesome. Your last bite of the steak is going to be kind of not so good. And at some point in time, you stop eating steak and you switch to the mashed potatoes on your plate because the mashed potatoes are now more desirable or more rewarding than the steak.
And so the prediction is if you get people to imagine the whole eating event or a longer eating event, then they won't want it anymore.
Exactly. So if we get people, if we get people to mentally represent the kind of repeated experience that they would have when they're actually consuming a food, that might lead people to desire to eat the food less. And so there's really sort of this prediction that a lot of the reasons why we, over time, we're less excited to continue eating a food are cognitive. So a lot of these may not necessarily be physiological, but sort of the mental representation itself may play a role in sort of the decrease in desire that we feel for these kinds of repeated experiences.
And so how did you test this?
So we had people come into the laboratory and we asked them to imagine different kinds of tasks. And so we asked people to imagine eating smaller or larger amounts of a food. So for example, we asked them to imagine, we showed them a bowl of 3 M&Ms and then we asked them to imagine eating those 3 M&Ms one at a time. Or we showed them a bowl of 30 M&Ms and we asked them to imagine eating those 30 M&Ms one at a time. And then what we did afterwards was we gave them a bowl filled with 40 grams of M&Ms. And we just said, please sample some M&Ms for a taste test that you're going to perform. And what we did was surreptitiously measure how many M&Ms they ate. So we basically took the bowl afterwards, we put it in a bag and then weighed it. And so we figured out sort of how much people ate in that instance. And so what we found was that people who imagined eating more of a food subsequently actually ate less of that food. So if I imagined eating 30 M&Ms rather than 3, I would eat fewer M&Ms.
It's cool. And so is it just for M&Ms or do they eat less in general? Do they think they're more full or is it just that specific stimulus?
So we've extended it to things like cheese and crackers. And cheese actually works better. So the virtual calorie of a cube of cheese seems to be higher than of M&Ms.
But say I eat 30 pieces of cheese, that'll affect how much cheese I eat. But then does it also affect how many M&Ms I eat? Do we know?
No, that's a good question. So one of the cues that this is sort of really mapping on to the kind of phenomena that we observe when people are actually eating is that people show their satiety or their habituation in this case is really stimulus specific. So we all sort of are aware of the phenomenon of the dessert stomach. So for example, you eat a meal, you feel like you're totally full, I can't eat anything else. And then the waiter rolls out the dessert cart, and all of a sudden your appetite comes back, right? And so this is a nice example of the case in which we find that, you may have habituated or satiated to steak. You may no longer be interested in eating any more steak, but when you see some kind of pie or cobbler come by, then all of a sudden you're interested in it again. And so we're only showing these kinds of effects for the food that we were eating and not necessarily for other kinds of foods. And so what we found there was we asked people to imagine eating 3 or 30 M&Ms or 3 or 30 cubes of cheese. And then afterwards we gave people as much cheese as they'd like to eat. So we gave them a bowl of 40 grams of cheese and people ate as much cheese as they wanted to for this subsequent taste test. What we found was that when people imagined eating 30 cubes of cheese, they ate fewer cubes of cheese than people who imagined eating 3. So I imagine eating 30 cubes of cheese, I eat less cheese than people who imagine eating 3. But the amount of M&Ms that people imagined eating had no effect on how much cheese they ate. So it
is kind of weirdly specific. It's cool.
Yeah, and so some really cool research that one of my grad students who just started a faculty position is doing is looking at, we find in this research that's sort of underway right now, is that we find that satiety tends to be sensory specific, but she's also looking at cases in which when we consume something, it makes us crave something else. And so often...
So I'm eating lots of Oreo cookies and I want some milk.
Right. So we often have cases where we're engaging in sort of co-consumption of two goods. So we might have like peanut butter and jelly, right? It's kind of weird to eat peanut butter on its own, or cheese and crackers. And in these kinds of cases, we often have two kinds of things that we consume in conjunction. And so she's really exploring sort of what leads, when do we satiate to a food as a response to imagine eating it? When do we have no response? And when are we actually sensitized as a response of eating something?
Super cool. So you guys must get asked whether you figured out the imagined diet suppression technique, you're going to write diet books and stuff. Are you going in that direction, or?
So we were asked to write a couple diet books. Here's the problem with this phenomenon.
Yeah.
So because it's sensory specific, so there's a couple properties of sensory specific satiety, or in this case, what we find is habituation. But generally, you could think about sort of the desire to stop eating what we've been continuing to eat. So it tends, in all these kinds of cases, these different processes, they tend to be stimulus specific. So, for example, if I imagine you're going to eat dinner, out with some friends, and you don't know what you're going to eat in advance, you would have to imagine eating
everything
what you're going to eat before you eat it. And then the problem is, once you eat something else, it's going to undo your habituation towards the food that you ate.
Yeah.
So, if I imagine eating a steak, then I eat some steak, but I'm going to eat less steak than I originally would. But now if I eat some mashed potatoes, it's going to undo that kind of effect. And so really, the kinds of cases in which this would work would be when you're planning on snacking on one thing. I think it might be helpful in there. And we'd like to do some studies where we sort of see in the field sort of what's effective. Can we translate this into the field? And our joke was that if we do a diet book, it would be really a flip book where you just go, you're eat, today I'm going to eat chicken. Okay. You just flip through the pages and it's the same piece of chicken 30 times.
Right.
Just imagine eating this piece of chicken, 30 times.
No, that's good. Although it does mean you'd sell lots of flip books, right? Because people have to buy a single flip book for every single food that they don't want to eat. So maybe it's a money maker.
Yeah. Maybe that's the future.
Well, we are about out of time, but I want to thank you again for telling us about all this work, and hopefully in a couple of years' time we'll have you back on with another one of our Mind Report members to tell us all your cool new stuff that you figured out.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Take care.